And also, I was only dimly aware, I hadn't really thought through until I was here, how it would help me being here to question productively some of the assumptions underlying my own research. And the focus of that research is the recent history of exhibitions of contemporary art from the Arab world and also from the wider Middle East. And that, by the way, is a term which I mention not to perpetuate, but which I think needs to be rigorously deconstructed. Tonight I'm going to talk a bit about my work in fairly broad terms. I'm going to start by discussing some artworks and then moving on to exhibitions more generally. And I'll also offer some observations about Darat al Funun and the role of making exhibitions in its history, but focusing particularly on the current exhibition, which you can see around you, which is called Rituals of Signs and Transitions, 1975 to 95. Some of what I have to say is a bit speculative, and so I welcome any comments, questions, and criticisms as well about it afterwards. They be both useful and gratefully received. Darat-Toone's artwork Measures of Distance is a video work from 1988, which was, along with another video, So Much I Want to Say, the first work on video, in video, that enter the Khalid Shaman Foundation collection. Both of them are on display in the current exhibition. In Measures of Distance, grainy slides of the artist's mother taking a shower, shot in Beirut in 1981, are overlaid by the text of letters in Arabic to the artist from her mother. Sound adds a third layer to the work, in which Darat-Toone reads her mother's letters, translated into English, aloud. This is intercut with taped conversations in Arabic between the two of them, where her mother speaks about her feelings, her sexuality, and the awkwardness around Darat-Toone's camera recording her naked body. These layers create a kind of distancing effect in relation to each other. They demand we pay attention to all three at once, and yet none of them is able to operate with absolute clarity and meaning on its own. Somehow, though, the juxtaposition of the three creates a whole, shot through with what the artist has called paradoxical layers of meaning and closeness and distance. The closeness Darat-Toone refers to is mostly an effect of the images of her mother and the overlaying imagery of her handwritten letters, so that her mother is depicted both visually, or bodily if you like, and textually in the form of communication between them in both written and oral forms. The photographic slides are almost shockingly intimate and exposing, though we never quite see her mother's naked form, partly because the writing works as a kind of screen. The presence of her body is also quite transgressive in terms of the politics around the depictions of women's bodies, and that was an issue that in the 80s had particular resonances when this work was made. And also in how the bodies of Arab women in particular are often represented in art. The artwork also relies on what Freud calls das Unheimliche, which is usually translated as the unhomely. That's the literal translation. But it also means the uncanny. This suffuses all of Darat-Toone's work, with its all of her works, her whole earth really, with their focus on using images or objects which are domestic or familial and rendering them strange, dangerous, or alienating. For me, as a viewer of the work many times over, Measures of Distance and the readings we can make of it has always seemed to be enabled most of all by that alienation, and specifically by the sense of distance embedded in the work, and the effect of something intimate, close, even domestic, the relationship between mother and daughter, being forced to exist across not only a huge geographical gap, but across different experiences of exile and displacement, and the different languages they use in their daily lives at a time of ongoing war. So these were the brute geopolitical and physical realities behind the production of this work. And the relationship between the personal and the socio-political context, which dictates the trauma of distance written into their relationship, is precisely what motivated the two to make the work in the first place. The other factor which vitalises it is the role of the artist as a presence. Darat-Toone's voice, her story, her mother, her gaze looking at her mother, and her biography of displacement are all inherent to how we read the work because they're inherent to the work itself. As I mentioned, I think a moment ago, this is an artwork which I've seen many times, and most of the times I've seen it has been in London or elsewhere in the UK where I live, but it's not where I'm from. But seeing it here at Darat al Funun, it took on a different sense of meaning for me in a subtle but profound kind of way. I don't mean that the analysis I just made would cease to be true, but in the context of the exhibition currently filling the Darat, Rituals of Science and Transition, Measures of Distance takes on a different framing and a different sense of historical and geographical context than that I have seen it through before. When I viewed this work in Britain, it seemed to be presented in such a way that the artist as exiled is the kind of primary way of reading the art. So this is often foregrounded textually in the kind of labels that are produced beside the work. But it's also in some way inherent to that national context, which it's often the context of display connects very broadly, and I'm talking in pretty reductive terms. The artist's gaze, her authorship, and her status as an artist working in Britain, which the English audio in the piece certainly explores. By extension, and also by implication, it becomes, in the context of galleries or museums in the UK, a fragment of narratives about Britain, colonialism, multiculturalism, and a very specific art historical discourse about art made by artists of non-European migrant backgrounds, which had a particular resonance in the 80s, but which endures the new forms now. Here, in an exhibition which looks at the relationship between artistic production, other cultural production, and the realities of history and politics between 1975 and 95 in the Arab world, I can't help but see this work differently. Rather than seeming to relate primarily to the artist as exiled outside the region, speaking from that space as exile, it feels as if it has been almost literally recentered. The geography that defines its existence and the experience of exile that calls it into being are situated quite differently. The measure of distance which the title proposes seems much more obviously to have two poles. Rather than circulating around the artist, her role in mediating her experience, it also operates in relation to the history that produced and continues to produce the distance from the other. So if the displacement of Hatun from her mother is a kind of alienating equation, seeing measures of distance in this exhibition underscores for me much more clearly what they would say you call the paradox of dispossession in Hatun's work and an essay he wrote about her. And also, it seems to underscore much more clearly the effects of that on both Hatun and her mother. So looking at this piece, and you can see it here displayed as it is right now in the main building, and thinking about how it functions in the framework of the exhibition, something sort of crystallised for me about what being here is for, in terms of how it might go on to affect my own scholarship and how I position my research as a project about exhibitions and the narratives, images and discourses they construct or perpetuate in relation to the Arab world. And also the Middle East, which as I've said, is a term for me to problematise and deconstruct. But nevertheless, it is one that is often brought up in relation to the kinds of exhibitions I'm looking at. And particularly in relation to exhibitions produced outside this region, in Europe, North America, and West Africa. So my research is based on analysing the way exhibitions are frameworks which produce or reproduce particular kinds of knowledge about place and identity in relation to the Arab world and the wider region, however loosely or specifically delineated in relation to actual places or countries they are. I want to go on to consider for a couple of minutes another artistic project which interrogated the central role of the exhibition in circulating and mediating art from the region, which also used the actual form of the exhibition to do this. And that is a project by Darat, broadly titled Scratching on Things I Couldn't Disavow, which began with its first ever iteration in 2008 in the Sphere Gallery in Beirut. I'm just note these pictures are all taken on a terrible camera by me, and so they're not very good. So I apologise for that. They're not particularly my definition. So in this body of work, Darat homes in on the matrix of curatorial creating, marketing, and the act of viewing, which structures the way in which art is encountered and documented in exhibitions and the processes which sit behind it, including archival processes. What he did when he started in 2008 was to mine the archive of then recent exhibitions about Lebanese contemporary art, and particularly those concerned with Beirut as the locus of that art. Atomising a selection of them with a characteristic sense of referentiality and layers of kind of deadpan fictionalisation. So what he did in this image is took a whole lot of documents, erased parts of them, especially the words, and rescaled them, reproduced them, photographed them, printed them at an incredibly high definition of a glossy paper, made them kind of very beautiful, and also turned them from documents into objects. They look kind of archival at first glance because that's what their origin is, but they're not archival. They also seem to owe something to a kind of minimalist conceptual aesthetic, and the white cube setting that you see them in reinforces that, but in fact there's much more trickier and more clever, not more clever, much more kind of, there's a trickster element going on, there's fiction going on. So he's interrogating the historicity of these documents as elements of an interpretive frame for art by turning them into objects which are somewhat inscrutable and highly aestheticised, and piling on layers of remediation and self-referentiality. One of the 6 parts of the 2008 exhibition was called Walid Sadek's Love is Blind. It was a simulacrum of a work made by Walid Sadek in 2006 for an exhibition in Oxford called Beirut. What Sadek did in that exhibition was to display labels about the paintings, labels for 10 works by the Lebanese modern painter Mustafa Farouk in English and Arabic. 2 years later, Rad decided to represent Sadek's work by shrinking it to 50% of its life size and having it painted directly onto the wall as a tombola, where the labels turned into just squiggly simulacra that were actually text. This was accompanied by a large text panel which set out in detail the process of negotiation which Sadek, that Walid Rad undertook, and also the kind of process of negotiation with the artist who painted this on the wall. His name was Rita Day. So if the original artwork in 2006, Walid Sadek's original artwork, was about highlighting the absence of a generation of pre-Civil War modern artists from the narrative of art in Lebanon because of a rupture produced by that war, then Rad in 2008, 2 years later, added another layer of remediation where invisibility and intelligibility, in the case of this image, words that have disappeared into painted squiggles to signify words that are actually absent, became very literal metaphors for that absence and that rupture. He also used his own history of his own work in this show. He's using his own authorship, his own critical positioning, to remediate another exhibition of his own work, presenting in perfect miniature a replica of the major Atlas Group survey exhibition which happened at the Hamburg Art Hof in 2006 or 7, complete with tiny versions of all the works displayed, including the videos. They were on the screens kind of like the size of a matchbox, or even some of them smaller. But it was a perfect replica in tiny form of that exhibition. This model was then later shown in other exhibitions after 2008, where Rad added another layer of fiction, claiming that the works from the Berlin show had been sent to Beirut full-sized, but that in the process of shipping they shrank, suggesting that there was a second rupture at play between the Western Museum as a site for the Atlas Group's largest ever exhibition. The Atlas Group, for those who don't know, is the name that Walid Rad gave most of his work from the mid-90s up until 2008. So suggesting that there was a rupture between the Western Museum in Hamburg and the gallery in Beirut, and that this rupture couldn't be resolved by the apparent similarity in the two spaces, that both white cube type spaces, and that the works couldn't actually be transmitted, as it were, from the original context in Europe back to Beirut. So in this exhibition and the subsequent iterations of the Scratching Things I Could Disavow project, Rad built a web of references around the works shown here, which I'll show you some of, and around the exhibition itself, continuing to highlight rather than deconstructing the two ruptures I mentioned, and also the apparent possibility of artworks and other aesthetic objects travelling across them or overcoming them. In the process, he was saying, I think, something important about the very idea of exhibitions which come to us under the sign of Arab art and which claim for themselves an Arab identity. And that is, apart from the existence of these ruptures, the way in which Arab art, both modern and contemporary, has been defined or identified accords with shifting dictates of the local, the global, and the external, the internal and the external. So, how this works is not new. Cosmopolitanism is not a new idea. And actually, much of the recent work on modern art in the Arab world by various scholars is at pains to point out that the supposedly new conditions of globalization have plenty of precedent in earlier periods, particularly after the 1950s, and earlier kinds of cosmopolitanism, regional internationalism, and so on. But both the languages and the strategies used by artists like Rad as a very good example, not the kind of formal strategies that have existed previously, and also much more internationally networked kind of formal strategies. Both of these kinds of strategies and also the context of the reception and circulation of art are now much more transnational and mobile in a much more thoroughgoing way than they were in the previous generations. Paradoxically, within what the theorist Tony Bennett has characterised as the exhibitionary complex are what could be called cultural geographies, particularly those in the non-West, the global South, if you prefer, have been and still are often represented via the geographical exhibition. Such exhibitions have a long lineage in the museological delineations of cultures in the 19th century, with civilizational hierarchies based on the very deterministic definition of non-European cultures. Museums and other institutional frameworks operate in relation to implicit claims of cultural power to collect, to define, to convene and frame art, and other kinds of culture. My point is this is part of the inheritance which comes to exhibitions of contemporary art, which attempt to represent either the Arab world or the Middle East, or even the Islamic world collectively by art. Also, when those exhibitions try and look at particular countries or cities from within the region. And there are maybe over 100 examples, which I can talk about and won't, from the last decade and a half. Exhibitions which make the relationship between place, culture, and identity their curatorial leitmotif. I will talk about a couple of them in a rapid-fire manner in a few minutes, and the three kind of prevailing tropes that they figure. But before I move on to that, I just say what we need to ask about exhibitions like the ones I'm about to talk about briefly is, firstly, how do they define place in terms of both space or location and time and historical moment? How do they seek to mediate what is specific and important about that place in aesthetic and historical terms? And how does this relate to notions of identity? And finally, how and why do they reinforce what the scholar of African art, Priti Maya, calls, quote, mapped taxonomies of difference, close quote, within exhibitionary contexts which are more attuned to fitting Arab culture or Jordanian art or Palestinian art or Lebanese art, for example, into representations which answer the needs of cultural and political cultures in the locations where the exhibitions occur, rather than in relation to the Arab world itself or places. So the three tropes I just mentioned that operate really widely in the kinds of exhibitions I'm looking at are the region show, the country show, and the city show. I'm going to give a couple of examples of each. So my first example, the first cluster is the kind of region show. That is exhibitions which try and look at the entire Arab region, or which try and look at other kinds of regions and which include the Arab world. So this example is quite notorious. It's called Without Boundaries. It was over a New York music phenomenon in New York in 2006. It's been very heavily criticised by artists, including artists who are involved in and even theoretical discourse on these issues, because it typifies a particular way of lumping together a lot of different, very heterogeneous practices under one banner, which is the banner of the Islamic world, and suggesting some kind of commonality between artists with radically different interests, radically different backgrounds in terms of where they live, where they work, where they're from, what identities they actually choose to affiliate to. And as I said, in this case, that was all under the banner of the Islamic world. And it did include a great deal of production from the Arab world. In fact, the majority of it was from the Arab world. This work on the right is not Shazam Sikandis, Pakistani artists. It also came freighted with a sense of historical importance, at least in terms of the rhetoric attending it, about its role as the first post-9/11 exhibition of contemporary art from the Islamic world in America. And with it, it carried an idea of what the anthropologist Jessica Winiger in a scathing review called a humanizing kind of notion about Islamic culture. Really focused around how that culture, which isn't one culture, it's diverse, is treated in terms of perception in America. Another example, also quite notorious, Unveiled, New Art from the Middle East, 2009 in Saatchi Gallery in London. Similarly widely criticised and focused on new art from the Middle East. So it said, although actually a lot of the artwork in it wasn't new, either in the Middle East or in Europe. It had been seen many times before. What this exhibition kind of exemplified was a kind of curatorial tourism with the collector as the kind of explorer. In this case, the notorious British collector Charles Saatchi, but he didn't actually curate the show. It was curated by Lisa Farjan from the Too. And then, perhaps more interestingly, and this is my final example of the kind of region show, the trio of opening exhibitions at the Mataff in Doha which opened on the 30th of December 2010 and went into 2011. They were pitched as what critic Kayla Milton-Goldie called the mother of all projects, finally addressing the gaps in knowledge, access and exposure that have blunted the study of modern art in the Arab world. They were also pitched as being about a move towards an Arab specificity, and away from the kind of sweeping geocultural or geo-religious cliches of the two previous exhibitions I had talked about. And at the same time, instituting a set of new ways of working with this new and brand new museum. They intended to show not only contemporary Arab art, but also, without ignoring the globalised context in which a lot of recent art has been produced, to try and bridge the ruptures that Wally Wright was talking about between the modern and the contemporary, through 3 exhibitions with different aesthetic and temporal frames, to construct a sense of continuum between Arab, modern and contemporary art. In terms of overcoming the apparent invisibility of the modern, the largest of these shows was called Sajid, a Century of Modern Art. And this is an image of one of the galleries of that show with works by Shakir Hassan al-Said. I chose that deliberately because there's a work by him behind the screen and I'm going to talk about it at the end. And next to that, a work by Dia Azawi. He's also represented in the current show in the Beta booth. This survey show, Sajid, arranged in very broad categories, had over 260 works, arranged very transhistorically and ahistorically, designed to celebrate what Nala Shabuid, the senior curatorial trio of that figure involved, called cultural Arabism. But discerning the actual context in which the artwork was made was close to impossible. Specific national or urban artistic and aesthetic histories were absent, leading to a feeling characterized by one critic as missing narratives, and an effect of contextual flattening, which appropriated the cosmopolitanism which has always existed in Arab culture and turned it into a kind of monolithic idea, which they called cultural Arabism, monolithic and kind of universalism. Another of the 3 exhibitions was called Told, Untold, Retold, 23 stories and journeys through time and place, at was the kind of contemporary pendant to the modern representation that such a book was trying to be. Again, I deliberately chose this work by Amman, which was another reversioning of the previous work I talked about in the exhibition. The contrast between this show, which had 23 artists in it, working in very critical, very divergent, very diverse kind of aesthetic registers, and the relatively conservatively curated subject, spoke to a wide attention in the role of that museum between the instrumental use of the museum as a hub and claim to regional cultural leadership by Qatar, and the intention to allow it to work more openly and experimentally. So although more interesting and less inclined to condemn it outright than the first two shows I talked about, it's still, in my view, highly problematic, and that's really to do with the kind of genres behind it and the way in which they dictated the forms that the exhibition took and the kind of work that the artwork was being asked to do in these forms. Finally, in this trope of the regional exhibition, the more recent one, here and elsewhere in the museum in 2014, which was originally going to be given the unfortunate title Yalla, until the curators had a rethink. It attempted to reinvent the trope of the Arab regional exhibition. It occupied the entire museum, and mostly it was arranged by country of origin, but in some ways also thematically. So despite the aura of criticality which the new museum trades on, it was not particularly groundbreaking or new in the way it made artwork speak as representatives of their country and their region, and themes pertinent to that region. However, as is the case for all of the exhibitions I've talked about, it did contain some quite amazing artwork, including Kalani here in the foreground, and also Marwan Roshnai's Yakubian building, which you might have seen in the slide earlier from the Saatchi Gallery. And that's an important point about that, is that a lot of the shows that fit into this kind of regional exhibition idea or trope have displayed the very same works, and I'll show another example of that. The second kind of designation or trope I want to talk about is the country show. The show that the exhibition that tries to look at one particular country. I'm going to give one example now. That was contemporary Arab representations in the Iraqi equation, which was not typical of the genre. It was based around the concept of the exhibition as a kind of critical agora or platform forum in the aftermath of the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. It had an ethic of criticality rather than closure, and it was the concluding part of a very influential multi-part project where the exhibition saw what the critic of the noting was for a great deal of other discursive activity. It was, according to its curator, Katrina, about building more precise knowledge from the, quote, debris diaspora of Iraq, mostly in the form of a bricolage of documentary and testimonial work rather than art, in order to contest the invisibility of Iraqi voices post-2003, but specifically their invisibility within Western media spheres. So again, it was very much an exhibition designed as a perceptual project within, in this case, Spanish, German, and Swedish context. Those are the three countries of the show, but also within the Western media sphere. But in the contemporary Arab representations project as a whole, foregrounded the need to balance a polemical focus on what it meant to represent the Arab world, and also to be attentive to specificities of time and place. So to represent particular places in interesting, ambiguous ways. And in a sense, it's one of the most interesting kind of Arab regional shows made outside the region. Also, because it appeared in forms that were specifically about particular countries or particular cities. This is another image from the Iraqi equation with some incredible archival photographs from the Arab Image Foundation, which were collected in Iraq before the Second Gulf War, and a whole lot of videos. This kind of typified what the exhibition was like to see. It was about watching video, about 18 hours of videos in it,
And so it gives you a sense of how it's not trying to be something that you can comprehend in one go, because you can possibly watch every single minute of everything that it had to show you. But also the Contemporary Arab Representations Project worked more famously through the third trope I want to mention, the third and final one, which is the city show. So that's the kind of exhibition that is about a city. So there were two, one about Beirut as a hub for the whole of Lebanon, and one about Cairo. Two exhibitions which were probably the most influential examples of this city exhibition genre, and helped consolidate the idea of the need to get very specific in terms of place and time, which would then lead to the architecture. They all beg the question, though, whether making exhibitions about places more specific to certain cities is actually more tenable politically, aesthetically, than making them about simply countries or regions. And that's a question I may want to have very many thoughts about, but don't really kind of give a firm thought on, because it's something I'm still thinking about. Finally, in terms of the kind of city exhibition, Cairo Open City, a show in Germany in 2012, which travelled quite a lot. I think there were 5 venues in all, which suggested that the pursuit of, which for me actually raised the problem of whether talking about a city at a specific time is more interesting or intellectually coherent than talking about a country per se or a region. Since what it did was fuse the representation of the revolution and the city of Cairo in a way which was quite problematically reluctant, and again aimed at making the revolution comprehensible and explaining it, the relationship between urban spaces, activism on the street, new media spaces, and activism via phones and via the internet and via Wi-Fi and so on, and the revolution in a way which actually just flattens that the revolution made it seem something far more simplistic, far easier to represent than I think it was. So I want to return now to Darat al Funun and think about its exhibitions and the final exhibition. And what I'd like to suggest is that the Darat and also the Khalid Foundation, as well as their precursor, has used exhibitions in a fairly different way to the kinds of institutions and projects I just briefly surveyed. Since 1988, when the Gallery at the Arab Bank, under the auspices of the Foundation, hosted its first exhibition, which was an exhibition of 8 Jordanian artists, one of whom, by the way, is included so with the current exhibition in the main building. So since that time, 1988, and also after 1993, when the Darat opened, exhibitions have been mounted which have ranged in size and scope from small group shows, often geographically focused, and especially showing the works of Jordanian, Palestinian, and Iraqi artists, to exhibitions of individual artists, again, sometimes small, sometimes more recently very large. Many major artists had their first solo shows here, to larger group shows. In fact, in 1993, the Darat was inaugurated with a permanent display of contemporary Arab artists with rotating content. And that was a tradition that continued for 9 years until 2002, alongside shorter monographic exhibitions. I'm not actually sure when this image is from, but it is, I believe, from sometime in that 9-year period. And it's again the main building. That in fact is the room where you can see the works at the moment. More recently, the program has had a more thematic thrust. And again, you might notice this work from before. That has included exhibitions like Art Now in Lebanon in 2008, curated by Andres Vicema, the same gallerist who gave Bobby Art on this show in the same year, which I talked about at length before. And that was also important in another sense because it was another example of the Darat's long history of collaboration with other institutions and entities, stretching back to 1989 and their first cooperation with the Institut de l'Art in Paris. More recently, exhibitions have got more ambitious, larger solo shows have filled the entire space, such as the exhibition that was on when I first arrived here in April. Many of these have integrated workshops, events, and dialogues, which has been another absolutely crucial part of how it works. This example is a program as part of the Just exhibition. So what this all clearly represents to me is an evolution in curatorial practice, but one with a very consistent philosophy in it. What then makes the products of this evolution different? Well, for me, it's a question of the kind of context that the data creates for art, and the institutional paradigm it represents, which, as I said at the beginning, is singular. It's what Sarah Rogers called a protected space in her essay in the book Arab Histories, which was an amazing and important volume published to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the beginning of the activities that became both Darat al Funun and the published Foundation. What I understand from my time here and my delving into the archive of publications and other materials which illuminate the history of this place is that as a home for the arts, not a museum or gallery of them, production is at the core of what the Darat is for. And production in a fairly expanded and symbiotic sense of the word. So production of art, including by artists working here on residencies often. Production of discourse, whether events like this or through the very impressive history of publishing that the Darat has behind it. Production of learning, of educational events, of artistic education like the Summer Academy, even music education, quite recently during the music workshops in Ramadan, which will have their culminating expression in a concert on Tuesday night outside in the Byzantine church grounds. And also, it's about the production of the space of the Darat itself as a hub and a protected space for arts. This has been an iterative process since it's evolved and expanded since 1993. First being on this side of the stairs, then more recently moving across to where the headquarters building is, and then the hub itself. And it's that production of the Darat as an actual space and as a hub and as a protected space is something which is literally written into the physical environment. As you can see here, where you see three works actually. The newest one being the mural by Amman on the left. In the middle, work by Hani Khan. And on the right, down at the very bottom, the satellite, which is by Jim and was part of this Palestinian Space Agency. So what I'm trying to say is that everything seems to flow from the productive nature of this protected space, including the work of collecting and representing art via exhibitions. The role of exhibitions in the Darat system is about activating and focusing the central role of production, whether of things actually made here on the premises and not so much. That for me is very different to the primacy of representation, which comes first in the institutional contexts which generate the kinds of exhibitions I summarised and criticised before. That is, from a culture of exhibition making focused on constructing understandings of the Arab world and its cultural production, building curatorial frameworks based on that task and fitting art within it, rather than starting with the production and starting with what artists are interested to do and what they need. So, leading me finally back to regional science and transitions. Because in the sense that I just defined what I think the Darat is about, it's very interesting. Because this exhibition considers a particular historical period in the region in a very fluid kind of way, which deals with similar territory of the Arab world to all of the shows I spoke to, but according to a much more open and much more situated curatorial logic. So 1975 to 95 is a 20-year period which the exhibition takes as its focus. It's the period also when the Darat was developed into a shape, and that history too is reflected in the exhibition in interesting ways, most especially for me in the ways it echoes both the Darat's earlier collective exhibitions of Arab art by bringing together work which varies hugely in formal, aesthetic, and thematic terms, and thus producing a kind of echo of the breadth of the collection and also of the breadth of the program across its history. And it interpolates that in a historiographic way into the wider history of the region during the war's formative period. This is a quote from this lovely booklet, which is available to any visitors to the exhibition. As the booklet says, the Rituals of Signs and Transitions investigates the relationship between artworks, political and historical transitions at the time. The period between 1975 and 95 proved to be crucial in the formation of the modern Arab world. In spite of treaties signed, not all wars that were ignited could be extinguished today. Art has seemingly perfected the cunning of history by creating an alternative universe meant to give signs and ask questions, rather than documenting the prevailing ugliness and fading beauty. For me, quite often the works in the exhibition actually do document what the brochure calls the prevailing ugliness and fading beauty, as much as they also manage to operate as part of the alternative universe aesthetic. But that documentation or testimony and the idea of an alternative universe both operate within the exhibition on their own terms, relatively speaking. So what I mean is that the relationship between 75 to 95 and the artworks is delineated in a much more nimble way than is often the case in exhibitions which attempt to match art and history. There's not an instrumental relationship between the objects and the thematic structure. Instead, the artworks are counterposed with each other with contemporaneous books and music. And that's actually really important. The presence of books, you can see them on the wall to your left, is relevant throughout the exhibition. The same with the music, most particularly Beethoven and Beethoven. And that's not just making a point when we think about the interrelationship of visual art and the other arts. It's actually also making a point about the way in which that interrelationship has been built into the history of the Darat since it opened. And that is probably best exemplified by the video in the main building, which shows the opening concert of the Darat in 1993. So the way in which the artworks are contextualized by this book and by the labels in each room, again you can see them to your left and behind you, establishes a historical context, but without imposing readings on the works which index them to specific events, except that they themselves carry those indexes, and without aligning them too directly with the historical narratives that the exhibition wants to kind of bring up. So that's textually one dimension in which the exhibition works to frame the artworks, but also leaves them unfixed, in my view, leaves them kind of open to interpretation according to how you see them. And that's the kind of textual side. But symbiotic with that is a spatial element. And that is that just as there's no fixed relationship between the historical focus and the artworks, there's also no strict beginning or end to the show, no defined route through it, no correct order in which to see the rooms. It gives a much more flexible sense of agency in making sense of the exhibition to you as the viewer. And that's characteristic mostly of the nature of the Darat, its own spaces. Not just where the artworks are being put, but the fact that they're there in 4 different buildings, in fact 5 if you include the supplementary works and the others. So as a context for the exhibition, it creates a kind of immediate sense of spatial openness, so that the visitor can encounter the works in any order, and will do depending on where they've entered, whether they've come in from that street, the stairs, the entrance on the along the street, down the bottom, and so on. So the result of that spatially and textually is a kind of fluidity, which, as I said, is written into the frame of the exhibition and inherent to the way it's manifested in the spaces of the Darat. And what that really does for me is it avoids the spectre of the kind of binding narrative or the magisterial overview which stalks most exhibitions, which attempt to deal with a huge chunk of historical content to do with the Arab world. that doesn't mean that particular historical moments or tendencies are absent or hard to discern. For example, this is, by the way, shows how the kind of juxtaposition of very different sorts of works happens in the exhibition. For example, there are works in different locations, all of which address in very different ways one moment, which is the Tala Zapa massacre. Works by Emil Chasset, ideas on and more broadly, there are works throughout, and again I'll go back to all the Charles works in Gaza series, which speak about Palestine, the cause of Palestine and also the art of Palestine. And that reverberates right through the exhibition in many ways, including in Untitled-Toone's Measures of Distance, where the fact of the families in exile after the Nakba is at the base, the animating fact of the work. Similarly, there's a kind of story within the show. There's about the dynamism of Iraqi art in the 70s and afterwards, which you can plot right through different spaces, including this work, which is actually there, right behind me. It's an untitled work from the 1990s by Shaka Hassan al-Said, a figure who was both exemplary and singular in the development of Iraqi art before, during, and after the 70s, since he was crucial to two of the various artist groups that were formed between the early 50s and early 70s, hugely involved in educating the younger generation of artists, and like many, like most actually Iraqi artists, also was forced into exile or expatriation. And this work actually has been used as an emblem of the show. It's on the booklet, it's also on the poster, which you see outside. And I think that's a telling choice, because the work seems to me to be symbolic of the nature of rupture as a historical force, which is also a force which operates within human subjectivity. That's something I was also saying about Untitled-Toone's work at the beginning. It's richly elusive, but it's not necessary to pin it down. So in that sense, it kind of stands for what the exhibition does as well, as a framework which allows for a unity of concerns and parallel experiences of history to sit alongside the individuality of artistic practices in a way which for me is hugely refreshing, especially when we thought about the juxtaposition of the tendency of exhibitions elsewhere to fix those two things together far too neatly and firmly. And as such, it's also true to the nature of Darat al Funun as a space of production, rather than as a museum which archives, rather than as a museum archiving representations in taxonomical narrative terms. So just finally, and to conclude, I want to express my gratitude again to the Darat and the Khalid Shaman Foundation for hosting me during this amazing fellowship and for making it such a brilliant and well-supported experience. It's been hugely pleasurable to interact with the team here, and all of them have been exceptionally welcoming and helpful, even though my work has been really quite removed from theirs on a day-to-day level. I'd particularly like to thank Super Shaman. His very clear vision is this vision, patronage, and inspiration actually is the thread running through the evolution of both the foundation and the Darat, and whose advocacy and energy make it both possible. But I also want to thank very much, in a very heartfelt way, in front of this, Ahmed Zatari, Rana Beruti, Muhammad, Yananda Jabek, and Allah Bashir, who've all been incredibly welcoming and helpful and made my time here amazing. So thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to, I don't know if anyone wants to comment, criticize, or ask questions.
Well, thank you for your lecture, especially for your empirical first review of the exhibition. And I like the way you did it. I wonder if you could go farther, if I go with your line of dividing it into from the Orient to the Arab world in a kind of a collective to then a national exhibition on specific space, national space. Can you go on and think of exhibition that were focusing on a specific group of artists in a specific moment, and also exhibition on a specific artist. I think of Marwan and the big exhibition in Damascus, showing the vertical perspective, or the Liberté, surrealist capture. Could you go in this direction, in this line of thinking of typology of exhibitions?
Yes, but that's not what I am doing in my scholarship. The reason being, what I want to look at specifically is the conflation of geography, identity, and art, and the idea of collectively representing place or culture or people, whatever any of those things are made to mean. So usually, it can sometimes be a thankless task because I probably have nicer things to say about some of the shows you just mentioned. A lot of the material I work on, I have to be very critical about because there's a problematic built into the kind of framing of, as you say, the Orient, then the Arab world, or then the Middle East, and the various different vectors of place that get applied to the region, if you like. So actually there are a lot of projects already that are going on, and I welcome them massively, that excavate the history of exhibitions of particular artists. So, for example, there's a scholar, Christine Hood, who used to be the assistant of Darat, who's been working on the history of the Sultan Gallery in Kuwait, and a very important role he played in the 70s in putting together art from the Arab world. It's a really fantastically interesting project. Similarly, there are other scholars at various levels, quite young ones like me, or older, more established academics, doing similar things. So the whole field of the history of exhibitions, particularly exhibitions now, in the period before the 80s, is mushrooming in a very fantastic way. So what I'm doing within that is actually something that specifically not just looks at the kind of group exhibition that says it's about the Arab world, or it's about Beirut, or it's about Jordan, and so on. But most often does that from outside. So it's about that externality problem, which also isn't completely fixed. We kind of fetishize the idea of the inside and the outside because the world is far more, the world is fun, and the way in which artists live and work and the kind of influences that come into their work are far more fluid than some kind of arbitrary distinction between the Arab world and everywhere else. Which is why the title of Here and Elsewhere at the New Museum is a flawed title.
As a complete non-artist, my reaction is that this is a region where the nation state is very much in question and fluid, where there is discussion of Ummah, there's discussion of Arab nationalism. It is particularly a region that lends itself to be looked at as a broader geographic space. And so are you seeing something distinctive in how art is curated in this part of the world versus Africa? Or what? Are there not some very good reasons why we want, whether it's looking at Mesopotamia or Levant or Arabia, to broaden, because the people in the region themselves put themselves in the political geographic context.
Yes, and yes, that's absolutely right. And so, for example, this show, which was about science and transitions, does that. And for me, it does it in a really interesting kind of way. It accepts the existence of the Arab world. I'm not trying to deconstruct to the point of ridiculousness the idea that there is an Arab culture. But I would add to that there are Arab cultures in the plural, which function in different kinds of ways, artistically and culturally, at different moments. So it's important to keep hold of that sense of what binds and not so much what binds actually, is what creates solidarities, cultural solidarities across the region. And also think about the particular moments in which things do play out in terms of the nation state. So the example I gave of the way that Iraqi art was included across this exhibition, and you can also see how the period between the 58 revolution in Iraq and the mid to late 70s was a very specific moment, very centered on Baghdad, very much focused also on the fusion of modernism and heritage in really, really interesting ways. So it's important to keep those two things in balance, I think. I don't know if that actually answers it.
But is this a unique issue to the Arab world, where you take a continent like Africa, which is never disaggregated? Aren't you looking at sort of the same phenomenon as the unknown is often looked at in the world?
Yes, yes. And no, you're right. It plays out in completely unique ways in relation to the Arab world, and also plays out in unique ways in relation to Africa, where it's even more difficult to kind of try and, I mean, how do you, people do actually try and say there's such a thing as African art, because creators make shows of African art. Now, that seems to be far more problematic even than making shows of art from the Arab world. But, and it's not just the choice to make those shows of art from the Arab world that I think is the issue. It's the way in which they're done. It's the kind of frameworks that are imposed on them, which are usually about making the Arab world comprehensible elsewhere. So again, to take the Murmur example, and it wasn't actually about that, it was about Islamic world, but it was mostly about artists and quite a few Iranians. That was about kind of humanizing, and that's really dodgy, I think, because there's nothing human, you know. But it was fitting with a kind of lack of cultural understanding of the Arab. It came with noble intentions. It's just the way it was manifested was profoundly problematic. So there is definitely this tendency towards geo-curating. Is the kind of broader context I'm interested in. It's not just Africa or the Arab world or the Middle East or the Islamic world, it's also Asia. Also, it's to do with specific countries. There have been so many exhibitions about China. But China is a country of 1.9 billion people. Very, very difficult to summarize in one country via a set of artistic tendencies. So that's the kind of broader problem in which I think the way in which the Arab world is curated plays out in particular ways. Something else?
I just would like to take this opportunity to thank Ted for this interesting talk. It's very, very interesting about exhibitions, the history of exhibitions, how they're organized, how they're laid out. We enjoyed having Ted tremendously in Dara. We benefited a lot from his insights. He had a lot of insights about the archiving. We're currently working on our archives, and he gave us a lot of insights. Thank you so much for your interesting talk. Also about giving you an introduction about the Dara and about the current exhibition, which I would like to invite you all to come and visit it. It's a very important exhibition that will stay until the end of the year. So you're all most welcome to come and visit it. I just would like to let you know we have on Tuesday, next Tuesday, we have a concert, and it's a result of a music workshop that was held here at the Dara, and we will be celebrating before our annual vacation in August. So the concert will be held at the archaeological site, and it will be very interesting, and you're all most welcome to attend. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you again